Welcome to the Dare to Know podcast. I'm your host, Fabian Corver. Today we are joined by Robert Berwick. Robert Berwick is professor of computer science and computational linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Professor Berwick has written 8 books and more than 200 articles on the nature of human language and its computational properties, how language is learned, how it develops and differs, and how it evolves and changes over time. In this episode, we will focus in particular on his book, Why Only Us? Language and Evolution, co-authored with Noam Chomsky. I hope you enjoyed this episode. The Dare to Know podcast is now also available on iTunes and Spotify. Please check out the links in the description below. Professor Berwick, welcome to the Dare to Know
Hi.
podcast.
Hi. Welcome to you, Fabian. Thank you
Yes.
so much for having me here.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. So maybe before kind of diving into the questions, could you maybe tell my audience a little bit about your background, what you've been working on, and how did you actually get interested in the work of Noam
Sure.
Chomsky?
Sure. That's fun because I come from a very sort of roundabout Renaissance background. So I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's like the old story Mark Twain said, recounting, the first 5 years of my life might take 6 years, and then that would be recursively would get too big. So, but in any event, I actually was interested in Chomsky and his theories about language even when I was just a young teenager.
Mhm.
We had a kind of science reading group, and we would pick books we wanted to read during the summer.
Mhm.
And one of the things was actually because it had recently at that time had come out, was Aspects of the Theory of Syntax by Chomsky. And we all read the first chapter, and that made a lot of sense to us. And like many people, then when we got to the second chapter, which was much more complex and technical about linguistics, that just made no sense at all to us.
Yeah.
So we just went out and played baseball, and
Is that-
then we said, okay, we'll come back to this. So I came back to it when I eventually got to college, because I was interested in computation, but in computation in lots of different areas. So one of the areas was, how does the language work with the mind? And I was much more interested in meaning and semantics then, and the way concepts worked. So I wasn't so much interested in syntax and the central thrust of what Noam was doing. So, but I, slowly started making my way through that, and I didn't really get uh, to grips with this until I reached graduate school. So for undergraduate school, I went to that place down the road, which is at MIT anyway, which is where I am now. It's sort of like Voldemort. It's the one whose name shall not be mentioned. So we all know what that place is. So I don't have to say the name. The name. But I was actually doing evolutionary biology at that time, which is a side work of mine that we'll come back to, because then it plays a role in the book I wrote with Noam,
Mhm.
Why Only Us, that we'll come back to. But so I was a serious evolutionary biologist. I worked with E.O. Wilson, who you may know, who was this very well-known evolutionary biologist who's worked with ants and sociobiology. And I worked with Ernst Mayr, the very famous German evolutionary biologist who was for many, many years at Harvard. Um, so I was seriously into that. And that was one of the things I thought I was going to pursue. But I ultimately was most attracted to things like human cognition and artificial intelligence.
Mhm.
So I didn't stick with evolutionary biology, because I actually had a falling out with E.O. Wilson over sociobiology,
Okay.
because I disagreed strongly with what the views that he had, and we
Mhm.
just didn't see eye to eye, and that's okay.
Yeah, no,
So we
it
just
happens.
differed. Yeah. So I came to graduate school at a fortunate time at MIT, because at that time, which was like the sort of latter part of the 1970s,
Mhm.
there was a lot of interchange between the groups in linguistics and the groups that were doing work in language, because at that time, uh, in particular, that was just when one of the people you've already had on the podcast, Norbert Hornstein,
Right.
actually came and started doing coming over to MIT and interacting with the people there.
Mm,
And so I got to know Norbert, and both he and my research advisor, Mitch Marcus. Marcus had just finished a parser, a sentence analyzer
mhm, mhm,
for English, where he thought he could actually explain some of the constraints that you saw in human language, that you could explain them via the way the parsing machinery operated. So there are constraints in language that we call locality constraints. So you can't take a phrase and move it, displace it too far. And so Marcus's idea was that, well, maybe I can explain this by the parsing machinery. So this was really, sort of mind blowing at the time that you could actually do this and bring these two things together. And that's what got me attracted to it. And I started diving deeply into linguistics. And then eventually, uh, both Marcus and Chomsky, and believe it or not, I got Marvin Minsky
mm.
on my thesis committee as
Oh, nice.
well.
Mhm.
So I think I probably had the only thesis committee that had both Marvin Minsky and Noam Chomsky on it,
Oh,
who
that's awesome.
otherwise who otherwise didn't really
See eye to eye.
see eye to eye so much, but it
Yeah.
was kind of cold fusion in a way.
Mm. No, that's awesome. That's really great. And
Yeah,
today, like you already mentioned, like you co-wrote the book with Noam Chomsky titled "Why Only Us: Language and
right.
Evolution." So specifically focusing on evolutionary questions. So what was kind of the motivation behind writing this book? Yeah, that would be great to understand.
Yeah, so early on, of course, both, as we say in our book, both Noam Chomsky and his graduate school friend Morris Holly, and this recent medical school graduate Eric Lenenberg, back in the early 1950s, already started thinking seriously about the biology of language. And Lenenberg and Morris knew German, so they had translated all of Tinbergen and the
Mm,
German works on ethology into English, so that then Noam read that all, and they thought that, gee, we should really think about how language actually arose in a biological sense. So is this looking at language actually as a part of human biology,
yeah.
and that naturally gives rise to questions of, gee, how did it arise in evolutionary terms?
Mhm, yeah.
And the way they all thought at the time was it must have been by natural selection somehow. But the difficulty was when you talk about the evolution of any kind of trait, like your eye, say,
Yeah.
you have to know what that trait exactly is.
Mhm,
What does it mean to have to have an eye? What are the different parts? How did they evolve in other animals?
mhm,
You know, what was what exactly happened? And so you have to specify that pretty specifically.
mhm,
But of course, until the sort of Chomskyan era, people didn't really have a great sort of understanding of what that was. And
mhm,
Chomsky was really the first, I think, in the modern day to really pin that down more precisely in a computational way, to say that, yeah, here are the basic properties
yeah.
that language has to have.
Mhm,
And so what prompted us at that time, in 2014, 15, to start writing a book about this was that there was a whole slew of very recent work,
mhm,
15 years worth, on the evolution of language, because there have been, by that time, several conferences on this,
yeah.
and work had started to build up. But it seemed to us that a lot of it had neglected the linguistic and the
Mhm,
biological side that we had already thought about for a while, uh, in particular linguistics. There was that part, and the second part was that there was Chomsky's idea of what he called the minimalist program,
mhm, yeah.
which was to say that we could really boil things down, at least for syntax, into just one very basic operation that would be enough to cover all of human syntax.
Mhm,
And once you do that, it's simplified enough that you can talk about it as if it's something like, oh, gee, it's like blue eyes or brown eyes, or it's clearly more complicated than
yeah.
that, but at least you could talk about it that way.
Mhm.
So that was our motivation, was to set that record within
Yeah.
this biolinguistic context.
And also
That's
in the
why.
book, I think you also mentioned that some people sometimes misconceive of this relationship between sort of this evolutionary thinking
Right.
regarding language and the generative
Yes,
linguistics.
because yeah, I think that's actually come from a misunderstanding, as often happens from I think oftentimes when asked about evolution of language over the past 30, 40 years, Chomsky
Mhm,
has often said, well, it could be just something happened with the brain getting larger.
mhm, mhm.
Now, but I think what people miss there is they miss his thinking about why it is that he would say something so general.
Yeah, mhm,
And
mhm.
the reason is because since we didn't know anything more specific, then what could you say? You could almost say that almost anything could have done this. And so that's his way of saying that.
I
But I
see.
think people took that in incorrectly to mean that it wasn't evolution by natural selection that played a role in that.
Mhm.
And it was something, very
Okay.
mysterious all
Mysterious.
at once.
I see.
But I think that's a misconception. I
Mhm,
think Noam has always believed very strongly in evolution by natural selection,
mhm.
um, and I don't think would ever discount that.
Yeah, that's helpful. And kind of in the beginning of the book, both of you describe Darwin's problem, or then also you term it more appropriately Wallace's problem. What is this
Right,
problem?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a very um, interesting point, which is that about 15 or so years, not sure if that's exactly the right date,
Mhm,
Wallace, Alfred Russel Wallace, who is the co-discoverer of natural selection along with Darwin, um, actually wrote to Darwin and said, I've been thinking really hard about some of the things that humans do, like music and mathematics and so on. And when you think about it, he couldn't figure out what would the adaptive value would be of something like a Mozart sonata.
mhm.
It's
Yeah.
not like
Yeah.
clear. I mean, how does that promote,
Mm,
reproductive
yeah.
success
hmm
and lead to having more kids?
Yeah.
Which is the basic thing that a fitter
Yeah.
individual has to do.
Yeah.
And so the way he put it in his letter was, so far as I could tell, we could get by with brains no larger than those the size of an ape's. So
Yeah.
why do we have such big brains, and why can we do all this other stuff?
hmm
He couldn't think of any adaptive reason. He said this is a real problem, and Darwin was a little bit stirred by this because he said, gee, if there's really something that's beyond natural selection and what my theory has been able to do, then what could it be? I mean, what Russell eventually averted to was something like, I don't know if you would really call it spiritual or, but something that was definitely extraneous to the current biological context and way of thinking, because he just couldn't come up with something.
hmm
So that's why we call it Wallace's problem. How do you get this? Why is there this discontinuity given that it's really kind of challenging to think of the adaptive value that leads to things like mathematics and being able to think of the origin of the universe and being able
Yeah.
to do all these astonishing things with our brains.
hmm No, that's interesting. And then I think, I mean, even though, from Darwin's problem, also kind of phrasing it as, Darwin's paradox, like how do we kind of reduce that? And then specifically in the case of, language. And then you specifically
Right,
talk about how can we kind of narrow down this
right,
phenotype so then we can actually reduce this, seemingly
right,
difficult sort
right,
of problem or paradox that we're dealing with.
right. Yeah. So actually, in a way, that Noam has really tackled linguistics, which is to try to chop it down into bite-sized
Yeah.
chunks. So it's the divide and conquer
Yeah.
view that science always takes.
Mm-hmm.
So you work with things that are you have more access to and are a little bit better well known.
Mm-hmm.
See if you can divide it into parts,
Mm-hmm.
And our our tentative hypothesis, because maybe it's wrong, maybe
Hmm.
this is a bad way to approach the problem, but
Hmm.
we just wanted to try it this way,
Yep.
was to say, okay, a lot of the substrate for what you need to do in order to have language, a lot of that biological substrate is already in place.
Yep.
Okay, so there's several different components we'll get to talk about there.
Hmm.
And so one of them is like vocal learning and
Hmm.
vocal production,
Yep.
or it could be sign generation and sign production
Hmm.
if you're a sign language user. But that was already in place, and there's some evidence we can bring up to talk about that.
Hmm.
And so we'll assume that's in place, and also at least some of these notions of basic what we call word concepts, or we call them actually word-like
Hmm.
atomic elements.
Yep.
And that, of course, is our way of sidestepping the very difficult problem
Yep.
of what human concepts actually are and come
Yep.
to,
Hmm.
because I think that's a really challenging problem. But we finesse that. We
Yep.
say, okay, let's just say that those kinds of things are at least partly in place.
Yep.
Now, so what do you need to actually join those two things?
Hmm.
And Aristotle, long ago said that you can think of language as a meaning that's associated with a sound.
Yep.
So the sound is obviously an external output
Yep.
of what's inside your head that
Yep.
has to do with language. And the word-like elements and the concepts are obvious. Clearly, those are internal mental
Yep.
computations and constructions of some kind. So how do you put those together?
Hmm.
So that's what we focused on.
Yep.
What's the basic operation that puts those things together?
Hmm.
And what's the evidence for that? And how could that have evolved? And
Hmm.
and by making it small,
Yep.
we wanted to account for the fact that it seemed like this didn't really take that much evolutionary time, considered over like a broad sweep of
Yep.
tens of millions of years. It happened relatively over, a few 100,000 years.
Hmm. Hmm. No, that's very interesting, and I think we'll have to unpack a lot of this.
Yeah, there's a there's a lot that goes into
Yeah.
that, and each one of those things, yeah,
Mhm.
deserves some kind of comment.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So, and kind of as you mentioned, you kind of take the divide and conquer strategy, and then specifically you cut this sort of problem of language into three parts, all related to
right.
the basic property, as you call it. Could you maybe explain to the audience and to me also what the
Sure,
basic property is and how we should
sure,
understand that?
sure. So the idea of the basic property is that when you actually compare what humans can do with language to
Hmm.
what all other animals who even do things like communicative signaling or have signal systems, there's this really huge
Hmm.
qualitative gap. So it's both quantitative and qualitative. So for example, just take like uh, if you think about the numbers of words that people use.
Hmm.
So all the animal signaling systems that people have ever looked at most you get up to a few hundred items. Uh, but when you talk about humans, there's many, many thousands, and we just can keep adding to them. So we've added podcasts, right? I mean, that
Yeah.
wasn't there 10 years ago, and now
True.
we have the word podcast.
Yeah.
No problem. So we have this ability to, this astonishing combinatorial ability that no other animals seem to have. And so that's one element of the basic property.
Mhm.
It's it's unboundedly combinatorial. So this goes back to the classic statement by Humboldt that language makes infinite use of finite
Yeah.
means. So we have a finite number of little symbols and sounds we have, but we can put them together and just keep going and build castles in the air.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So our arbitrarily long novels like Proust's that go on in, Recherche de Temps Perdu,
Mhm.
where, he starts at the beginning of the first of these three volumes And as some people in the audience might know, he actually wraps that first sentence around to the very last sentence of the book, many, many, many thousands of words later. So it's astonishing we can do this.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so that's this property. So it's unbounded.
Yep.
The second thing is it's digital. So it's not analog. It's not like a sound system. And that's important because most animal communication systems are in this way analog. So if an animal has to make a warning cry, they'll shriek. Well, they'll make they'll do something that has the emotive content attached to the words. And of course, people do that too. But we have something in addition, which is that the words, when you have sentences, you have words that are 3 sentences long or you have sentences that are 3 words long and 4 words long, but you don't have sentences that are 3.5 words long.
I see. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's digital in that sense. And finally, and this is another key thing that differs from what animals seem to do. It's hierarchically structured.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you can say, actually, I wrote down a complicated sentence, which I'll just read. So it's just to show you. I mean, so you can say that, the guy ate ice cream. So how do we know it's hierarchically structured? Well, you get even complex sentences like this, which are actually sort of hard to unwind.
Mm-hmm.
Almost inconceivably, the gun into which she was now staring was clutched in the pale hand of an enormous albino with long white hair. Now that, of course, that shows you that you can make misuse of finite means with language, even though that's taken from a very popular book, Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code.
Mm-hmm.
But you can conjure up this picture, which consists of sentences that are where one is embedded within another. The gun into which she was now staring was clutched in the pale hand of an albino. So, they just, like I say, it's like building a kind of castle-like structure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So animals don't do this at all.
Yeah.
They don't have any of that stuff. And they don't have words like the or a or forget it. There's just nothing like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I mean by the basic property.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have the basic property, if you can capture that, then you've gone at least part of a big jump between what animals can do, all the non-human animals can do, and what we can do with language.
Yeah, so and that's a radical difference, I guess. And certain people in that theories are going to deny one of those properties. So that that is going to happen.
That is, of course, what's going to happen. But I think it's pretty challenging to deny it, since people do it all the time, and since it's true that no matter how hard people have tried, they just haven't been able to get animals to come anywhere close.
Yes.
To this kind of combinatorial productivity.
Yeah.
So if you even think of that's why I even mention this words like, so if I say an albino, the long white hair. So if you even think, or the second green ball. So I have that word like the.
Yeah.
And you might say, well, what's so special about the?
Yeah.
Well, the point is that there aren't any other animals that have these kinds of words. They're called determiners.
Yeah.
But and in all languages they form a kind of there's a fixed number of them. They're called closed class words because there's a fixed number of such things. But other animals don't really have that at all. And yet when we've done studies of infinites, by the time you're age 2 or 2.5 even, even before you understand what the noun is, so if I say the Zorch, so I don't know what Zorch is. They understand what the means and what its role is. So it's almost like they come first. The words like the and a and so on. The kids can hear those specially, and they can latch onto them to kind of build a scaffolding for the rest of the sentence. And this has become more and more apparent over the last 5 to 10 years. The kids are doing this very early.
No, that's very fascinating.
Yeah, and animals don't have anything like this. So if you look at what this very famous uh, chimpanzee that was taught
Yeah.
American Sign Language, Nim. If you look at even Nim's signs, he didn't really have words like the or some,
Yeah.
and we can come back to that later on about whether Nim even actually had the word like apple.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of people that say that Nim really didn't get the idea of what an apple was in the human sense
Yeah. Because I think
of the word
there.
apple.
Because I mean, I guess we can jump to that sort of topical question. I
Sure.
guess like related to that, at least what I read in the book is right that like many sort of animal sort of communication has some direct relationship between the sounds
That's
and
right.
things in the world. While
That's right.
yeah,
That's right. So when you talk about animals, then it's almost as if there's an actual hard wire,
mm-hmm. Yeah,
like a
yeah,
string that connects between, and if it's a vocal utterance, that actual vocal
yes,
sound, that signal, and some direct physical link
yeah,
in the world.
mm-hmm.
So that's why the animals aren't talking about something that happened in the past or
Mm-hmm.
something that might happen in the future,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
or a conditional. Gee, if I move this rock, then
mm-hmm. Yeah,
my friend might find something. And so
yeah,
there's none of that.
mm-hmm.
It's all these direct associative links,
Mm-hmm.
and that which as my friend Norbert Hornstein would say that's the hallmark of empiricism.
Mm-hmm.
These
Yeah,
direct associations.
yeah, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's only in human beings that we find this link, this direct string that ties, the utterances, these vocal productions to direct things in the world. That's broken.
Yeah, mm-hmm.
That's completely snipped.
Yes, mm-hmm.
And so we're free to actually shift from the direct links to the physical world to imagine things inside our heads that don't even exist, like unicorns.
Yes, mm-hmm. Yeah, mm-hmm.
There's no link between, how could there be a link between a string in my head and a unicorn? They don't exist.
Yes, yes, yes. Mm-hmm. No, that's
so,
yeah.
so
That.
that's profound. And that's a profound break.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's exactly what Chomsky means when he talks about the unbounded stimulus free creative use of language. It's stimulus free in the sense there's no external stimulus that where I saw a unicorn and therefore I have something in my head
Mm-hmm.
about
Yeah.
unicorns.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I read about unicorns. My mother told me about unicorns,
Yeah.
and of course I built up a concept.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But that's a very different kind of beast,
Yeah.
literally,
Yes.
than
Mm-hmm.
what other animals have.
Mm-hmm.
So
I,
it's
th- I
very
think
special.
Yeah, no, I think this was very fascinating. With my limited sort of knowledge on this sort of evolutionary story, when I was reading the book, I thought specifically here sort of the evolutionary story also that kind of links with this very radical break. When we look at how our words connect, not in a direct way to the world as it is with animals. Usually that's in the context in philosophy of referential semantics, but here
Right.
it also gets
That's
sort of an
right.
evolutionary grounding where no, actually we are dealing with something radically different, and it's not
That's
just
right.
purely the philosophical argument; it's also sort of the evolutionary basis for that argument. I thought that was very
That's
interesting.
right. That's right. The fact that actually has a biological basis, that
Yeah,
we've cut the ties
yeah,
between us and the physical world.
yeah,
So we actually have a mental world that's
yeah,
much richer
yeah,
than just the external physical environment.
yeah,
That's the real leap
yeah,
to what is, you might say, is human uniqueness.
yeah,
That
mm-hmm.
makes us unique
Yeah,
compared to what other animals can do.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No,
And
and I
I
think
think,
like
yeah,
to stress that uniqueness, you also actually I think at one point I don't know if it was Darwin or Wallace like quote like there's really this unique human and moral quality that's kind of
that's right.
built
That's
into it,
right.
which seems to be even more an expansive sort of
That's
notion.
right. That's right. So I think there's a lot of other things that come along with that.
Yeah.
That, but it's true that so we get that, and the other animals don't have that.
Mm-hmm.
So that gives us, and as we say, of course, that gives language an enormous adaptive value. So we don't, we're perfectly in line with
Yeah.
evolution by natural selection there, because we say that language, that it is in fact a highly adaptive system.
Mm-hmm.
That it's pretty clear
Yeah.
from how overpowering humans have become in
Yeah.
actually blasting through the rest of the world,
Yeah.
that it's a big advantage, reproductive advantage, to have
Mhm.
language as opposed to not having it. Uh,
Yeah.
Notice that's not to say, I guess we'll come back to talk a little bit about this.
Yeah.
That's not to say that, the world could have gone along, for a long time, maybe even forever. There could be other worlds, if there are other worlds
Yeah.
with biological life, when
Mhm.
there probably are,
Mhm.
where there are where something like language never evolves.
I see.
And that's I mean, after all, I mean, there were it was a long, we went through, I don't gee, I think it's now nearly, I think maybe think people think 3.6, 3.9 billion years when life first arose. We went through most of that time
Yeah.
without any creatures that had language
Yeah.
as we know it.
No,
And
certainly.
it was a perfectly, adapted, fine
Yeah.
world. So there's nothing that says that language has to, be there. I think
Yeah.
people that see that it's a very interesting thing. This is a kind of philosophical point, but I think that sometimes people that say that, gee, language, you know, emerged in us, and there's some kind of internal drive. So eventually you have to get to creatures with something like language. That's not necessarily so. I mean, Ernst Mayr made this point, and Chomsky has talked about it, because I think I pointed him to the quote
Mhm.
where Mayr pointed out that if you look through all the history of life,
Mhm.
there's maybe 3 or 4 species total
Mhm.
that evolved any kind of really substantial intelligence.
Yeah.
So the other sort of hominin species also have, and there are certain birds that are, very quite intelligent in problem
Yeah.
solving. But all the rest of the species don't. So that
Yeah.
means that either it's the case that, gee, you don't really need to be intelligent to get by in the world and
Yeah.
produce lots of offspring,
Yeah.
or it could mean that this kind of high level of intelligence is very difficult to obtain,
Yeah. Mhm.
to evolve, or it could be some combination of both of those.
Mhm.
But it
I
just
think.
means it's just not a necessary endpoint. And people that embrace it often have this kind of, sometimes hidden, sometimes not,
Mhm.
idea in the the progressive view of evolution. This view
Okay.
that's long been discarded, of course, and
Mhm.
it's very anti-Darwinian, which is to say that life has to sort of steadily improve,
Mhm. Yeah. Mhm.
and that's just not true.
Mhm. Yeah. Mhm.
I mean, evolution can have all kinds of dead ends. It can
Mhm. Yeah.
back up. It can, and so on. But
Mhm. This also actually reminded me. I think it was also a quote in your book regarding like Carl Sagan. I think it was about like intelligence. So we talked about like Darwin's problem and sort of this seemingly a paradox that intelligence in itself is sort of a similar type of paradox. I'm not sure if you
that's right.
if you had any thoughts about that.
That's
Like,
right. That quote I gave you from Ernst Mayr was actually during a debate he
uh,
had with Carl Sagan,
okay. Hmm.
because Sagan was one of these great optimists
Hmm.
about the existence of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe.
Yeah.
And Mayr said, "Well, gee, we only have one example here. Let's look at the one example we have, which is
Yeah.
Earth.
Hmm. I see. Yeah.
How many
Yeah.
times how many times has intelligent life actually appeared on Earth?"
Yeah.
And he said it's very rare.
Yeah.
So why would you expect this to appear everywhere else in the
Hmm.
universe too? It's just there's no it's the point that evolution doesn't have a progressive direction towards it,
Yes.
to anything.
Hmm.
It doesn't go anywhere in that sense.
Hmm.
It
Yeah.
just makes do with what it has. And if something like intelligent problem solving isn't needed to get reproductive success, then it's just not going to appear.
Yeah.
It's
Hmm.
just not going to be. So I think that's an important point to bear in mind.
Mhm. And kind of taking maybe a step back before kind of diving into
Sure,
some of these topics again. So
sure,
also in the context of evolution, you kind of also discuss how you embrace both the long-term possibilities, so millions of years and hundreds of thousands of generations, and the short-term, a few thousand years and hundreds of thousands generations. I think you
right.
referred to this already before. So, what is your motivation behind taking this position, and why is this potentially still
Ah,
controversial with some people?
yeah, I guess the way we tie together those two sort of disparate time frames.
Yeah.
So one is this long-term view, uh, which has to do with the fact that we're all descended essentially from one sort of universal common ancestor,
Yeah.
some hundreds of millions of years ago,
Hmm.
and we share a lot of the characteristics of that with
Hmm.
other animals of that common ancestor. So it's what Darwin called descent with modification.
Yeah.
So this kind of process has happened over hundreds and hundreds of millions of years, actually billions of years. Uh, and what that means uh, is that there is, in fact, a kind of unity to all of life and a commonality that we all share to greater or lesser extent, depending on how closely related our last common ancestor is to other animals. So, for example, I might not have the percentages exactly right, but I think we probably share about 40% of the same genes with tomatoes.
Yeah.
And I've often reflected on this because if you're vegan or something, then you might get, if you worry about ingesting, genes that are actually also found in animals, then that might start to bother you. But only 60% of the tomatoes okay, 40% isn't, or something. So I said, so where do you actually decide that that
Yeah.
something's
Yeah.
um, and the point about that actually now leads to a much deeper point, which has to do with it is actually true that a lot of evolution does proceed by these sort of gradual
Yeah.
incremental refinements and steps.
Hmm.
So when you talk about, for example, the light receptors in eyes,
Hmm.
they're all descended from one or two or variations on a common chemical that can be receptive to light that
Yeah.
impinges on it. Those are called opsins, the
Hmm.
chemicals. And they change shape when the light hits it, and that can lead to a cascade of to a nerve signal, bloop, and then you detect the light signal. And that over many millions of years has gotten incredibly refined to the extent that our eyes are so good that we can really detect almost the evidence of a single particle of light, a single photon, is enough for our eyes to register that. And that's remarkable.
Yeah.
But but this is widely shared amongst lots of different animals.
Yeah.
And this kind of refinement does indeed proceed by gradual steps. So that's sort of the long view,
Yeah.
which encompasses the unity of and the common substructure to all of life.
Hmm.
That and that and that's how evolution actually works, because there is this sort of basic substructure or chassis.
Hmm.
You can actually build on that, on success stories that each of those components has,
Hmm.
and then you can actually start to invent new things.
Yeah.
So that's the long term. Now, the short term, we talk about that too, because when you look at evolutionary novelties, well, it's true that the novelties often get refined after their first use. When they appear as novelties, there's typically a change in function from how they were used before. So a good example there is that if you talk about bird flight and feathers, it used to be a problem. This was something Darwin thought about, and other people after Darwin thought about. How do you account for feathers? Because if you have only a little bit of a feather, it doesn't do much good for its function in flying.
Hmm.
And well, the answer seems to be that lots of dinosaurs, and birds are one branch of, you know, related to the dinosaurs, actually had feathers, but they were more like the furry type of feathers.
See.
Maybe they were used for something else.
Hmm.
So now coming back to the language case, we think that, again, a lot of the substrate for language was already in place.
Yep.
So, for example, this business about vocal learning and vocal production, so how you make sounds and how you learn them,
Yep.
that was already in place. And maybe even some of the basic computational abilities, like being able to search for properties or features of the words that you have in a sentence, that was already in place. But what was not in place was the ability to put these together in a hierarchical way.
Yeah.
That wasn't there. So that happened, we think, over a relatively short period of time. So that's why we address these two kinds of two sorts of evolutionary timescales.
Because like, at least it seemed to me when I was reading, like, many people are on board with, like, the gradualist picture, but like they have difficulty with accepting sort of this shorter time frame. But you do argue in the book that it fits, more with the actual phenomena and innovations and novelties that we do see, right?
Well, at least some of them. I think, again, when it comes to evolutionary biology, it's almost like like the law, where everything's a case study and an example.
Yeah.
And so there'll be some examples that fit that pattern, and there'll be some examples that don't.
I see. Yeah.
So if you want to, for example, I guess Neil Shubin has written a book recently called "Some Assembly Required," which is an entire book written about evolutionary innovations and how they happen. And so he goes through, for example, the story about the dinosaurs being covered with feathers, and eventually that leading to birds. And that's fine. I think there are lots and lots of examples like that. But there are, when it comes to some of the really major transitions that we've seen in evolution, there have been sort of relatively shorter and more rapid changes.
Yeah.
So let me give you another example that's not language.
Okay.
We think language is another one, but an example that we think is not language is, in fact, the example with eyes again.
Yeah.
Because Darwin talks about this in Origin of Species, where he says, well, gee, I can trace back eyes, being simpler and simpler. And what natural selection has done has honed the perfection of the eye in terms of the focus and the iris and the shape of the eye. And when I trace that back further and further and further, I lose track of that when I get to the sort of almost the beginning of the eye, when there's one cell that can detect the light that's coming in, and there's another cell that can react to that signal that the light detector has just made. But I can't go further than that. That's what Darwin said. I can't reason further than that.
Yep.
Well, the interesting part about that is that, we fast forward a couple hundred, to 2011, and the scientist Gearing, who was the guy who discovered the fact that the development of many types of eyes are governed by sort of master regulatory genes, where you switch on that gene at the top, and that, like a pachinko machine, starts up a cascade of other changes that leads to the construction of many different kinds of very different kinds of eyes. So Gehring actually went back and looked at this earliest origin of eyes, and in fact found that gee, it was a kind of event where the reason why you had the nerve cell and the light cell joined together was because one of those cells actually ate the other one.
Okay.
It's called phagocytosis, from the Greek phago, to eat. So it actually ate the other cell. And then that created the primordial eye. Well, that kind of event is a novelty.
Yeah.
I mean, as we said, it might have not happened, in which case we wouldn't have even started off
Yeah.
evolution of eyes. We think that that's unlikely because there's such a advantage to having light detection that at some point it would have happened.
Yeah.
But that particular event was a chance event.
Yes.
A similar one has to do with the origin of the so-called energy, you know, factory of the cell, the powerhouse of individual cells, which are called mitochondria. So as we know now, as Lynn Margulis first, or at least was one of the first to discover and pursue in the 60s, the origin of mitochondria was when one cell actually gobbled up another one, gobbled up and internalized it. And what it ate actually became the mitochondria, what one cell ate.
Yeah.
And that was a big leap that did not obey natural selection, because it essentially gobbled up all the genes that came along with the mitochondria. And to this day, our own mitochondria retain some of those genes. Some of them, actually most of them, that were in the original gobbled up cell, the original mitochondrial cell that got gobbled up, have migrated to our own, central organization that holds genes. It's called the nucleus.
I see.
But there are some that are still left in the mitochondria.
Okay.
That's how you can tell that the mitochondria used to be an independent living organism. It even has a membrane that looks like it was an independent living organism. So it's kind of fascinating that way.
Yeah.
In fact, and there's a whole science of now figuring out, when you look at the internal structure of these of our cells, there are all these fairly sophisticated what are called organelles, and they're all sort of the residue of ancient events where one cell gobbled up another one.
Okay.
And all those little events are not events of natural selection. They're outside of that. So another example is if you talk about the chloroplasts inside plants, the chloroplasts are the system that photosynthesize. They take the light and they turn it eventually into sugars. That again is the case. The chloroplasts are cells that were gobbled up by other cells.
I see.
So all these big things that happen. Yeah. So the creation of plants, the origin of the basic energy of animals and plants.
Yep.
Those are all, they're called endosymbiotic events, to give a fancy name to them. Endo meaning inner, and symbiont meaning that those two cells sort of live together. And so we think that language, in a way, bears some resemblance to that, not because one cell gobbled another, but because there was a sort of more rapid change in what happened.
No, these are very fascinating examples.
Yeah.
No, that was great.
But we should get back to language.
No, that was.
I told you the evolutionary biology will probably filter in.
No, that's great. I really like it. So kind of looking at the origins of language, you argue, or you set out sort of a tripartite framework with three different components. So can you maybe walk us through sort of this framework and how it helps us?
Sure. So so dividing up the world of language into three parts is following our plan of divide and conquer.
Yes.
So I mentioned earlier, so we have an external part, which is whatever gets, if we're actually going to not use language just inside our own heads, but actually get it out to the outside world, then there's got to be some way to externalize it, to get it out.
Yeah.
And that can be through sound, it could be through gesture, or through some other modality. So there's that part. That's one of the parts of the tripartite part. But ordinarily for humans, it's vocal production and learning. And so that's one part. And the second part is the meaning component, which is the interface to all the other cognitive processes that do reasoning and inference. Okay, that's the second part.
Yep.
And now we need a third part, which is the basic property, which links those two together. So its job is to uh, generate these hierarchical structures, as we mentioned earlier. So they're pretty sophisticated hierarchical structures, and it's a complicated sentence.
Mhm.
And it feeds them to the other internal part,
Mhm.
the reasoning, and the other cognitive processing part.
Mhm.
On the one hand,
Yep.
and on the other hand, it feeds what it has to the vocal production part,
Yep. Mhm.
which has the job of then, actually saying the sentence,
Yep.
spitting it out, and actually laying the words out one after another.
Yep. Mhm. Mhm.
So that's the idea of make it tripartite, uh, which is to make our job easier, which is to just say that most of the vocal stuff that evolved before, long before language came to the stage,
Yep. Mhm.
and then was tweaked
Yep.
depending on the way language looks like, uh, to work better and better. So
Mhm.
we fully agree that there's natural selection involved there,
Yep.
and actually tweaking the vocal system
Mhm.
so that it works well with whatever is inside your brain. That's actually the basic property, and it's actually generating the
Mhm.
structures of language.
Mhm. Yep.
So we think that's fine.
Mhm.
And on the other hand, we don't say much about the the other cognitive processing part
Yep.
because we just don't have a lot that we understand or can say about that.
Mhm.
I mean, there are other researchers that do have some things to say about that, about how what they typically call logical form, how that interfaces
Mhm.
to the rest of syntax. But
Yeah.
we don't go into that in the book per se.
And and maybe zooming in like the toolkit that you discussed regarding sort of the vocal learning and sort of the literature behind that
Yeah,
regarding birds, like that would also be interesting
yeah,
to
that's
understand.
fun. Yeah, the birdsong stuff is fascinating. That's right. Actually, first got yeah interested in that when I hooked up with all the people at Utrecht that were doing work on birdsong. So there's
Mm.
quite a few.
No, that's great.
So I've learned a lot from them.
Mhm.
Uh, and there, I think the most intriguing recent work that we talk about in our book has to do with birds. We can do experiments that you can't do with people. So you can
Yeah.
actually look at uh, vocal learning songbirds and non-vocal learning songbirds,
Mhm.
and then you can do genomic experiments and see which genes get expressed when the bird is either producing
Mhm.
their vocal song that they've learned or during the time they're learning it, and and how that actually works. And so there seems to be a set of 30 to 40 or so genes that get turned off and on. This is work that was done down at Duke. Uh, when you compare that to human vocal learners, then the overlap looks very similar.
Mhm.
And not just at the genomic level, when you go to analogs of the circuits that you see in the brain, like major pathways, for
Mhm.
example, in vocal learning birds, there's a direct link between the cortex in the birds down to their sound producing organ, which in birds is called the syrinx.
Mhm.
It's not exactly as it is in us, where we have what's called a larynx. They have a slightly different organ, but there's this direct connection. And in the non-vocal learning birds, you don't see that wiring.
Mhm.
It's not it's just not there.
Mhm.
And then when you turn to the animal side, in us, there's again a direct connection
Yep.
from our motor cortex down to our larynx.
Mhm.
But when you look at non-vocal learning uh, primates, for
Mhm.
example, like a macaque, then you don't see it.
Mhm.
So it looks like that toolkit. Now let's think about what it means to say that that's common then between the vocal learning birds and us. Well, that means that you have to trace back to the common ancestor between birds and us. Well, remember, birds are like dinosaurs, And so the common ancestor between dinosaurs and us, you have to go back a really long ways, like several 100 million years
Mm,
before you find the common ancestor that probably, possessed that toolkit. So either that was held in common and passed down to both,
mm,
or, and this is an alternative, which could be equally valid, maybe even more valid, is that it was reinvented in both birds and us independently.
mm,
That's sometimes called convergent evolution, where you have separate strands that converge on the same solution. I
mm.
don't think we really know the answer to that
I see.
question
Mhm,
yet, although I might be wrong,
mhm,
but uh, but that indicates the same, and that's very typical again of evolution, which is to reuse
mm,
the same components over and over again in different ways,
mhm,
sort of juggle them around,
mhm,
and then you use them the same way, and you get a new behavior like vocal learning.
mhm.
Uh, that's a very very good broad theme that you see repeated across the evolutionary board in many different kinds of animals.
Mhm. And maybe connecting sort of this discussion with
Sure.
another discussion. So, uh, you know, when we specifically focus on like this externalization related to vocal learning and kind of put it in the broader context, where some people argue that language on a sort of selectionist account is a system whose function is communication, where it seems to be
Yeah.
tied up with externalization. How do those considerations that we just discussed, like, do they support a view where it's said no, actually it's not the main function of language to serve sort of communication, like there's some direct consequences, or how would you sort of approach that question?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and the reason, of course, because when you first even think casually about language,
Yeah.
it seems so. The first thing that hits you is, gee, I talk to people every day.
Yeah.
That's what language is for. It's for
Yeah.
talking to people,
Yeah.
and it's part of the social group
Yeah.
that fits naturally with what other primates do
Yeah.
to behave socially. So that, I mean, that's a coherent, compelling story,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't deny that is a compelling story in and of itself. And there's a lot of people who have embraced that, and that I think if when people disagree with what we've written about, I think that's one of the primary reasons is that seems like such a compelling
Yeah.
argument that, gee, that must be what it's for.
Yeah.
But again, I think one has to be careful about saying what language is for. A point that Chomsky has often made is that language is for many different things, just like the skeleton, uh, as we say in our book, that's its purpose, its function is for many different things, not just to hold us up in our body shape, but part of it is for producing the antibodies that are going to fight COVID after you get your vaccination. That's tied into your skeletal
Yeah.
system.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you actually know a priori
Mm-hmm.
what anything is for
Yeah.
until you actually investigate this? You can't just take that as a given.
Mm-hmm.
And so we think when you dig deeper down into things with language, it becomes to us more compelling to say that, well, gee, language is for internal thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we're not the first, of course, to present that. I think this view goes back again, maybe even to Aristotle. I don't know, but certainly to the Cartesians
Mm-hmm.
in their century, that they viewed it as part and parcel of thought,
Yeah.
having to do with rationality.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and and again, a lot of your thought is internal
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and doesn't have to do with speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And we know, in fact, that there are people, for example, there are people who are deaf mutes,
Yeah.
who never speak at all, and yet they're able to have language. They have the language faculty in the normal sense that we describe it. And if you actually they're able eventually to learn to actually write,
Yeah.
and they can gesture and say, oh yeah, this sentence is grammatical, this one is not,
Mhm.
and they seem to have a perfect command of their particular language and grammar. So
Mhm.
they have the language faculty intact, even though they can't externalize. So
Yeah.
it's not so externalization isn't seemingly necessary.
Yeah.
And furthermore, there's this very interesting thing that we do that, again, just to divide us from all other animals. Other animals don't do. And this was pointed out to me by the animal ethologist Mark Hauser, who wrote a whole book on animal communication, which doesn't mention language, by the way, on purpose, because he wants to say that, that's something just that's just different from animal communication.
Mm-hmm.
And he points out that if that in terms of our language, we create the language inside our heads, and then the externalization is not specific to its modality, that is, to the external means in which we try to express it
Yeah.
in the following way. So that, I mean, the obvious case is that, so if I'm born and I'm deaf, then I can use gestures, I can use sign language.
Yeah.
So, but this is even true if you're an ordinary sort of, if you're a speaker. If you're a speaker and I gag you and tie you up and tape your mouth shut
Mm-hmm.
and say, but you're still thirsty, you're still going to gesture with your hands
Mm-hmm.
to try to express
Yeah.
the
Mm-hmm.
fact that you're thirsty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then furthermore, if I then tie down your hands, as what Mark Hauser points out, you'll probably use your feet and start, tapping with your feet
Yes.
to try to express the same thing. And it
Mm-hmm.
goes on and on from there. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's just, you know, the thought's inside and it's already there in terms of its linguistic structure.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the question of actually getting it out into the external world.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, the little point of subtlety that we wanted to make clear, I think it's been misread by some people, which is, I mean, the simplest thing to say is that, okay, so that linguistic structure there that we have inside our heads, that's coextensive. It's the same as our language of thought. And that's the strongest position to take. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. But I mean, it could well be that you know we're constantly talking to ourselves, even in our sleep. When we're not talking, we can hear this running monologue of speech to
Mm-hmm.
ourselves. There might be some deeper thought that underlies that
Oh,
that
yeah.
we
Yeah,
just
okay.
don't that we just don't have access to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And here we're not talking about unconscious thought in the Freudian sense,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because in particular, because in the Freudian sense, remember, the unconscious thought is simply that which has to be brought to the level
Yes. Mm-hmm.
where you can actually vocalize it.
Yes. Yes.
So
Yes.
so
Yes.
it can't be that. It
Yeah.
has to be
Yeah.
something. And this would, by the way, would also account for the fact that when you actually speak, one has at least the phenomenological sense of assembling fragments that you've already somehow put together in other places and you're now bringing together.
Mm.
And
I see.
otherwise, the rapidity of this would seem very mysterious, I
Mm.
think.
I see. I see. So just to kind of clarify for myself, like this phenomenological point is kind of like it comes, your thoughts come in fragments and then you put it together again. But these fragments
Right.
seem to enter in very quickly,
That's right.
before
And so
even constructing.
maybe they've been pre-assembled and stored away
Mm.
someplace,
Yeah.
because the brain has immense memory resources that
Yeah. I
we
see.
we really clearly don't understand. That'd be another fun topic.
Mhm, mhm. And maybe also related to this discussion, which is also something you highlight in the book regarding a conflict between computational efficiency and interpretive communicative efficiency. I
Right.
guess this relates to what we just discussed. And, every
Absolutely.
single time you mentioned universally, language resolves the conflict in favor of computational efficiency.
Oh,
So,
absolutely.
yeah, what's
Yeah,
the importance of
absolutely.
this observation?
Well, that shows that the externalization part is really secondary.
Yeah. Hmm.
That it's really the internal machinery of thinking
Yeah.
inside your head that really counts.
Hmm.
And and in fact, I think that solves another sort of evolutionary puzzle,
Hmm.
because an evolutionary puzzle for a lot of these people that say, oh, it was about communication and efficiency in communication. Well, how do you ever get the ball off the ground? How do you get started? Because if it's just in you and maybe in your a couple other of your kin, then who else do you have to talk to?
Hmm.
But suppose it's the following. Suppose you have that. So we'll just do an extreme case. Suppose that in fact you don't have, there's just you that has the language,
Yeah.
but you have kids, and you have a spouse, and and so on, and there's other relatives. So, well, you can then use language to plan out how to go do a hunting party,
Hmm.
and then you can use whatever means you've been using for hundreds of thousands of years, like gesture,
Yeah.
or
Hmm.
whatever you want, or by drawing on a sand with a stick in the sand,
Hmm. Yeah.
and you can still do that.
Hmm.
And so language would still be useful, even though there's just one person
Yeah.
that
Hmm.
has it.
Hmm.
Now, we don't think that that's actually true. So I
Yeah.
want to
Hmm.
dispel any notion. We're just sort of making up a story
Yes.
because
Hmm.
no one really knows.
Yes. Yes.
But the
Yes.
point is that to say that it's got to be communicative efficiency.
Yes. Hmm. Yeah.
Well, surely it's the case that somewhere along the line, after there's lots of people, there's more people that are actually communicating,
Hmm.
then in fact communicative efficiency does in fact matter,
Yeah. Yeah.
because we know that, and this has popped up in recent articles, just a week and a half ago, about looking at the shape of Neanderthal ears,
Hmm.
that human ears are actually tuned to the frequencies of
I
speech.
see. Hmm. Yeah. Hmm.
And so that, yeah, so sure, that makes sense that
Hmm. Yeah.
over typical evolutionary lengths of time, we've become better adapted to the sounds of speech and to speech production.
Yeah.
And that makes sense. But as to the origin of language,
Hmm.
we think that's slightly different, or rather big in a large way different,
Yeah.
because it needn't have been driven by communicative efficiency,
Hmm.
but rather by this internal language of thought and being able to use language internally,
Yeah.
because then it bypasses this difficulty of having to have lots of people to speak to,
Yeah.
and bypasses the difficulty of saying, gee, what reproductive advantage does that really give you
Yeah.
of just being able to talk to one other person?
Hmm. Yeah.
I mean, the evolutionary biologist Richard Lewontin years ago, in a very well-known article, pointed out, gee, if you were the first person to start talking in a group of, say your group is like 20 people,
Hmm. Yeah.
and all of a sudden you start talking, what's the most likely thing? It's not going to be a big advantage in
Mm,
terms
yeah.
of
Hmm. Yeah.
having more kids, which is what
Yeah.
natural selection comes down to. And he says, I don't think so. He said, he was being half joking, of course. He said, I don't think so. I think it's just as likely they would have driven you out because you were such an oddball.
Yes. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Hmm. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, why not? I mean,
Yeah.
it's just,
Mm.
and these people that posit these scenarios
Yeah.
where we really don't know what the reproductive advantage was of this or that alternative.
Yeah.
I
And
think that that's a challenging thing to do, and I think that's where a lot of the empirical difficulty comes from. Is it's very hard to tell
yeah.
what the. I mean, when evolutionary biologists go out and try to figure out, oh, this trait of having, well, I'll just make up a trait, having, having brown eyes, that was more adaptive than having green eyes.
Yeah. Hmm.
You actually have to go out into the field and actually measure how many kids each group is having,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and those and what the alternatives are.
Yeah. So yeah.
Because if there's no alternatives, then it doesn't matter. I mean, does it surprise anybody when you go into a McDonald's that you come out with a burger and
Yeah.
fries?
So that, yeah.
I mean, that's not surprising.
Yeah.
If those are your only choices, that's all you got,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
I mean, so you have to actually measure, uh, and this is what oftentimes is forgotten in evolutionary analysis, measure it against the backdrop of what the alternatives were at the time.
I see. Yeah.
And so it's not an easy business. It's
Yeah.
it's
No,
re- it's
it's hard work.
re- it's really hard work.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Because like, I guess just for the general audience also, like, in the book you do mention some other alternatives, which is like a long list, what people
that's
discuss,
right.
some people, which I think still maybe is useful to at least mention, to see kind of what are
Oh,
the other
sure.
sort of narratives. People talk about gossiping and like story
Yeah.
making or
So
all those
so
sort of things.
gossiping and grooming. So as I said, I mean, maybe it was used as a way of social bonding.
Yeah.
And sure, that might well be true.
Yeah.
Uh, if that were true, you would have thought that maybe communicative efficiency would have been
Yes.
more prominent,
Yeah.
and that you would see language that was skewed the other way than what we see now.
Yeah.
But we
Yeah.
don't see that,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
that's why we discount that.
Yeah.
Uh, and again, that's not to say that any one of those alternatives might not have been what really happened, because we don't have a time machine
Yeah.
and we really don't know.
Yeah.
But we're just saying that when you have evidence from several directions that all point
Yeah.
in the same way, that lends credence
Yeah.
to what
Certainly.
to the position that at least we try to sketch out. And it is just a sketch. I mean, ultimately, I guess we can wind back to this when we talk about what to do for the future.
Yeah.
Ultimately, we hope we're going to be able to come up with what the actual neural implementation of language, what that actually looks like,
Yeah.
and then ultimately from that know what its genomic basis is, and that'll tell us a whole lot about if it holds true to what's happened with other animals and plants and organisms we studied. That'll tell us a lot about what might have happened in the
Yeah.
past.
And maybe kind of taking a step back again and just talking about sort of the biolinguistic perspective, like just that stance, sort of like, how does
Yeah,
that provide sort of a good basis of investigating sort of linguistic
yeah. I
phenomena?
mean, yeah. I mean, it's all a mouthful to say biolinguistic, but in a way, it's just taking uh, the biology seriously in terms of that language is ultimately something that's part of biology,
Yeah. Hmm.
part of human biology
Hmm.
in several different senses.
Hmm.
I mean, from one standpoint, it's something that we all share that's the same in us, but different from what happens, that's different from the biology of a dog.
Yeah.
So if my pet dog, grows up with my baby daughter and hears every single word my baby daughter hears,
Yeah.
I'll bet you €1,000 to one
Yes.
that my dog is not going to talk like my baby daughter. It's just a different biology.
Yeah.
And so from one standpoint, that some people have called this the sort of weak biolinguistic sense, that we just take that into consideration when we talk about what's special about human language as opposed to, say, animal communication systems.
Mhm.
So that's why I don't ever like to use the word animal language, the
Yeah.
sort of,
Yeah. That makes sense.
because it just isn't the same thing.
Mhm.
Just isn't the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's and as I said from the start, uh, biolinguistics just meant joining those two,
Yeah.
um, and taking the biology part seriously.
Mhm. And maybe also related to this topic, which I thought was a very interesting observation, looking at the field of, biology and the history of biology, and then kind of taking a view on sort of the history of linguistics, where both fields have, seemingly struggled with similar sort of issues, specifically related to sort of the unity and the diversity question, like how those can
Right,
both be accepted. I thought
right.
that was a very interesting lesson. Can you maybe, tell a little bit
Sure,
more about that?
sure. Yeah, that's a profound point. I
Yeah.
mean, this idea of unity and diversity in biology, uh, something that has been in the field since the time well before Darwin.
Yeah.
I mean, people have noted similarities between different different organisms.
Yeah.
So like a whale looks like a dolphin, and looks like a shark, but they're also different.
Yeah.
So there's both unity, but there's also great diversity.
Yeah.
The parallel there with human language is that there's both unity in that all human languages seem to share common features.
Yeah.
So they all look like they have, at least to some degree, nouns and verbs, and they all have this hierarchical structure, this basic property.
Yeah.
But at the same time, as we know, there's this babel of different languages,
Yeah.
that many thousands that have existed over time, and well over, I guess, 6,000 or something today, maybe more. It depends how you count the notion language and how you
Yeah.
define it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's lots of diversity,
Yeah.
and the parallel between those goes deeper, though, in that the origin of the unity of biology comes from the fact that we all originate from the same common ancestor.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's descent with modification to fill different sorts of ecological niches.
Yep.
So the variation is driven by the fact that there's competition between individual species for the same sort of niche. And so one will drive out the other into another kind of niche.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get this branching diversity,
Yep.
this great diversity where every little niche seems to get filled.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there are impossible ones that never get filled. So
Yeah.
there are no animals that have eyes in the back of their heads,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and so
Yeah.
on. There's no animals that have wheels for other reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so well, similarly in language, there's this great unity we all share, our common genomic heritage of the human language faculty. That's what Chomsky calls universal grammar.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
universal grammar is not a grammar, it's just this
Yes.
universal genomic language faculty.
Yeah.
So we
Mm-hmm.
all share that.
Yeah.
And then the diversity, again, I think is in fact driven by the same sort of thing, by what might be called niche exclusion.
Mm-hmm.
So that if you're in, if you're in one area and you know you want to actually speak a little bit differently from a group in another area, then there's a kind of, those tend to get driven apart slightly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So all those same events that happened when you form the creation of species seem to happen with languages too. And that was noted in the 19th century. So those parallels were drawn even then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there's a tension. So languages have to be alike enough so they all can be learned from simple
Yeah.
examples
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that you get when you're growing up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But at the same time, there has to be enough sort of flexibility in the system
Yeah.
that you get this variety that you see.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you can't have too much variety, because then if languages could be anything at all,
Yeah.
then you could never learn them.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. So the diversity has to be constrained in some way,
It has to be
but
constrained diversity.
yeah, exactly. But then it is still interesting, which one do you want to emphasize, right? Because some people might say,
Yes,
oh no,
that's
this
right.
is but then, for example, Chomsky sometimes makes the point that if an alien would be looking down on us, it might seem
Yeah,
the
it's all
same.
point of
Yeah.
view
Yeah.
from a million miles away.
Yeah.
You know, it all looks the same, just like all beetles look the same
Yeah.
until you start studying beetles.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or if you're E.O. Wilson, you start studying ants.
Yeah. Yeah.
You see, oh, it's not just black and red ants. There's like
Yeah.
many thousands of different kinds of ant species.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So it's
Although,
all
yeah.
all about point of view.
Yeah. Although some like I'm also thinking in those terms that sometimes it's mentioned, oh no, but you do need like this uniformity in some sense that needs to be presupposed before you can get to the diversity, where there seem to be some
That's right.
high order. So I think that's also probably a point that like has to be emphasized
Yeah,
then. Yeah.
I think that's a good point. So there's always when you look at some particular diversity, uh, when you're doing biology, you go back to the common ancestor
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
and see how they diverged.
Mm,
Uh, with languages, you can do the same thing. So there's a
yeah.
whole study of the branching you get between two different languages. So
Mm,
many people are familiar with the way this is the way that, for example, that the archaic languages have been reconstructed. That was one of the great triumphs of 19th century linguistics, was to reconstruct Proto-Indo-European by studying the various extant languages that were around at the time.
yeah. Oh, that's very
So
fascinating.
so in many ways the methods share
Yeah.
some of the, and they've actually, there has been some crosstalk between them, and where one has borrowed the techniques of the other and vice versa.
No, that's very fascinating. And maybe on the topic, I think we mentioned it already a little bit earlier in the conversation regarding sort of the atoms of computation, the
Mm,
lexical items, concepts, like you, as you already mentioned and argued, like they appear to be unique to human beings. But, you also state that, and I quote, in some completely unknown way, our ancestors developed human concepts. So that seemed to be a big mystery
yeah.
there. Why is that so? And you mentioned there is some research going on in trying to understand that. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit on what sort of research is happening on that front.
Yes. Yeah. And in the book at the time we wrote it, we simply finessed the question
Yeah.
because it was this challenging one that we just didn't have the means to address, and it's a difficult one
Yeah.
because it comes back to this whole business about how it was that our human ancestors broke this link between immediate sensation, this
Yeah.
associative link between immediate sensation
Yeah.
and direct events in the physical world, how that link was broken,
Yeah. Yeah.
which we think that's why we call these atomic word-like elements mysterious, because that breaking of that link does to us seem very mysterious, how that actually happened.
And
I think that's still mysterious.
yeah.
I don't think we have a clear-cut answer to that.
And just maybe to pick on one thing that I know, so you say like word like, right? So we're not necessarily saying like words, but word like is there some like
Mm.
importance in differentiating that?
It's just because we simply just didn't want to. We wanted to avoid the confusion with identifying those elements as being one to one the same
Oh,
as
okay, I see.
words.
I see.
That's all.
I see.
So that's why we called them word like. So
Mhm.
when you say apple
Mhm.
as a concept,
Yeah.
there's both the way you pronounce the concept apple as apple,
Mhm.
and that's why we say it's word like in that sense.
I see. No, that's very
And,
fascinating.
and as I said, there's many others from Laura Ann Petito up to the present day who have mentioned that the chimp nim that was
Yeah.
taught American Sign Language didn't ever really pick up the human word apple,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
the word like human for apple, because what nim would do when with respect to the ever receiving the sign apple or producing it. I
Yeah.
mean, apple for nim was all the direct hardwired associations between apple
Yes.
and the knife in the drawer
Yeah.
that was used to cut it,
Yeah.
the place where the apples were stored, the place where the knives were stored, all the associations.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now it's very interesting. I'll tell you, just to bring it back to the present day,
Okay.
because when you look at modern natural language processing,
hmm
they've finessed the question in exactly the same way I just described.
hmm Yeah.
Because since they have no theory, nobody does really, of quote concepts and what words are, they simply have finessed the question by saying, we're just going to make a list of all the associations between words and the contexts in which they appear in sentences,
Yeah. hmm
all of them.
Yeah.
So they just go through the entire World Wide Web and say, if I find apple and apple's next to knife in this part of the web, then I'm just going to pull that. They call that word vector analysis,
Yes. Yeah.
and that's sort of the quote modern way to do it, which is by this kind of brute force.
Yeah. That's very interesting. Actually, maybe related to that, but this might be like a stupid question. But like when you mentioned in the beginning of the talk, right, like these words like "the" and "ah," like how do you make sense in that sort of modern approach? Because they're, contextualizing
You
those
mean
words
like
seems to
the
be very difficult.
you mean like if you just have an expletive like da
Yeah,
or
exactly.
huh?
Like how do you like try to like extract like sort of
Yeah, I think yeah, part of that difficulty is that overlaid on top of our actual human language system,
Mhm.
there's still this uh, I think earlier system of emotive interjections
Mhm.
and those are interlaced and overlaid on top, so they're intertwined.
See.
So I think that's where you see those kinds of interjections occurring, because they tend to have more of this emotional content that's associated with them.
Okay.
So I don't think that's a perfect answer,
Mhm.
but or maybe even not even a good answer, but it's my answer. So
No, it's good. It's very interesting, and maybe moving on a little bit. The following thesis also gets discussed, like strong minimalist thesis. So
right,
like what is it about this sort of thesis and how it relates to the evolution of language that is kind of
well,
helpful.
right. So the strong minimalist thesis ties back to our whole business about saying there's just the basic property
Mhm.
that can account for most of what goes on in language.
Mhm.
That's why it's called minimalist, because it says there's just one
Yeah.
basic property.
Mhm.
And the second part, it's strong because it says that's all you need,
Yeah. Mhm.
and that's a very strong and uh, possibly easily falsified assumption or thesis.
Mhm.
But it helps a great deal because then it says that's what we want to focus on.
And
So
mhm.
and it's gotten us a long ways. So I mean, in more recent years, Chomsky has talked about how to make that even stronger by making merge even in a certain way simpler. But I think that would be room for a whole other
I see. Yeah.
podcast to have Noam come and talk about that.
No. Yeah. And observing sort of the field of linguistics as a whole, like you quote one scholar in the book saying, and I quote, linguistics is at the stage at which genetics found itself immediately after Mendel. There are rules of sentence production, but we do not yet know
Yeah,
what mechanism neural networks are
right,
responsible.
right,
So can you maybe elaborate on this quote?
right. Yes, that points to this gigantic this gap,
Yeah.
this yawning chasm between
Mm-hmm.
uh, the abstractness of what we say when we talk about the basic property, because we just give it in terms of merging two elements together into a set. That's very abstract. I mean, what's that look like down at when you're talking about cells and neurons firing and so on?
Yeah.
So there's a huge gap there. So the parallel there between that and what happened with Mendel is that Mendel's, when he grew his peas and he raised peas and counted the different colors of the offspring and found out they obeyed very specific algebraic laws. So he could write down equations for these little laws. Nobody understood them. So he was ignored for 50 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So till from the middle of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century,
Mm-hmm.
essentially. And then they had to sort of rediscover him all over.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's an interesting fact that after Darwin's death, there was a copy of Mendel's writings was bound up in a book in Darwin's library, but the pages were uncut, meaning he hadn't even bothered to actually cut them to open it to read,
Mm-hmm.
which would have been a help to him because that was one of
Mm-hmm.
the major defects of his theories. He didn't understand how inheritance actually worked. That it actually was based, like Mendel's peas, on particular particles, which we now know to be genes
Mm-hmm.
that were inherited, and that's important for variation.
I see. Mm-hmm.
But So the parallels are very close. Nobody understood Mendel's algebra until the rest of the science caught up with it,
Yeah.
and then realized that it could be instantiated as genes, which took a while to, and of course the details of that are still being worked out, but
Yeah.
they're immense. I think similarly, we have this abstract basic property, and we're now like in sort of the place that Mendel was in 1860 or so, roughly. And we just don't know how that gets realized, how that gets cashed out
Yeah. Yeah.
as neural circuits.
Yeah.
But there are people thinking about this and working on it. But it's going to take, that's going to be the major, I think the major endeavor for the next several decades at least.
Fascinating. And maybe to wrap it up as a sort of a final question, future directions of research, like how do you see that related to everything we discussed today? Maybe some topics specifically that you're working on in this sort of context that you think are still fascinating questions.
Yeah, there's two really. So one is that so as I just said, people have thought a little bit about the neural implementation of something like the basic property, say merge, and in fact, we're beginning to see at least initial attempts at developing implementations of that are faithful to what we know about the biology of the way neurons work.
Yeah.
So you send a chemical signal to a neuron and it spikes, and if there's enough spiking connected to other neurons, they spike.
Yeah.
And can you use such a model, even in an abstract form, to do something to at least mimic what the basic property does? So there's that, and there's alongside that neurobiology of figuring out where in the brain this is occurring and exactly what the order of operations is. So those are two main lines that I actually have my fingers in looking at, because I think that's where we'll first find something about how that might actually get done. And that in turn will tell us a lot about how language evolved.
Yeah.
Because if we know that, we'll know more.
Well, Professor Berwick, thank you so much for this conversation.
Okay.
I really enjoyed it. You have
great.
any parting words to the audience?
Well, I guess if I had parting words, would be to read what you read in the New York Times and other papers, but always remain a healthy, skeptical, open mind to what you read, and figure that out for yourself by reading other things. Because I think this is one of the fields where you have to synthesize a lot and take from many different fields to figure out what's going on in this most complex of human behaviors.